My name is George. I'm the branch manager for Bearings 2000 at our Cape Town branch. And yeah, thank you very much for taking the time to attend our very first webinar. We really appreciate it. So yeah, well, what we'll do is we'll take questions. You can post the questions on the chat site, and we'll deal with them either afterwards, or if it's just a short answer, I'll try and answer them as we go along. So yeah, let's get going. Sorry, guys. There we go. So the purpose for this webinar is to gain a basic knowledge of the bearings to assist the procurement of bearings, understand the different types and variations of bearings to look out for when ordering bearings, to know the difference between the different brands that is available out there in the market, and to become aware of the counterfeit bearings and just some tips on how to avoid them when you do purchase some bearings. Just a quick look at the webinar content for today. So we'll quickly have a look at the purpose of a bearing. We'll have a quick, just the history of the bearings, have a chat at that. We'll look at the composition of bearings, identification of bearings, the different brands of bearings, the different types of bearings that you do get and the numbering of them, and then just some information about counterfeit bearings. Okay. Let's start off the purpose of a bearing. So the main function of a bearing is to reduce the friction between two moving parts and to transfer the load. So the two basic types of friction that you do get is sliding friction and rolling friction. So you can think to yourself, when there's a lot of friction, there's a lot of heat and it may seize, and that's the main reason for bearing, is to make sure that everything runs frictionless. Just an insight into the history of bearings. You can see there, 2600 BC, the ancient Egyptians, they used some sort of a roller bearing there. That's a type of a roller bearing, if you want to call it like that. 40 BC, that's a type of a wooden bearing that they've used on the boats. 1500s, Leonardo da Vinci, he drew up or mentioned some sort of a ball bearing. You can see the drawings there, so bearings has come a long way. But the modern bearing basically started in the 1883, when the FAG, they begin to grind the balls to an equal size and roundness. And obviously from there on, everything happens, and that's where the modern bearing has started, and that's where we are today. Having a quick look at the composition of bearings. Bearings generally consist of four parts, namely the inner ring, which is there, the outer ring, the cage, and the rolling elements. So the cage is there to keep the rolling elements in place. Obviously, there are a couple of exceptions that we do commonly use, like the spherical plane and the needle bearings. We'll have a look at one or two of those as we go along later in the webinar. Just keep in mind, this is a very basic of bearings. There will always be exceptions to the law that we will discuss as we go along. So going into the identification of bearings, especially from a buyer's side, this is critical to make sure you purchase the correct bearings. So the shape of the rolling elements in bearings determines the category that the bearing will fall under. Ball bearing, roller bearing, or plain bearing. So below are some common shapes of the rolling elements that is available out there. You get the ball bearing, the cylindrical roller, the taper roller, the symmetrical barrel roller, a symmetrical barrel roller, and a needle roller. Also, the reason why you need to determine the different shape of the rolling element is because different types of bearings are designed for different applications, and they are not always interchangeable, even if the dimensions of the bearings are exactly the same. So bearings are designed to accommodate the different types of loads that is being applied to the bearing. You get three different types of load, which is radial load, which is basically from the top of the bearing, load being applied on the top of the bearing, axial load, which is from the side of the bearing, and then combined load, which is radial and axial load. Okay, so to identify the size of the bearing, when the bearing number is not present, you will need the following measurements: the inside diameter of the bearing, the outside diameter of the bearing, and the width of the bearing. That alone obviously will not give you the type of bearing that you'll need. So to identify also the type of bearing that you might need, you'll need the shape of the rolling elements. What will also help when you have experienced suppliers is the application of the bearing, and if it's sealed, shield, or open type of bearing. Okay, so having a look at the different brands of bearings that is available to the market. Obviously, we're not going to list all of them, but just to give you a general idea, probably the leaders quality-wise will be your European standards, which is the SKF and FAG brand. The Japanese, which is probably intermediate, but it's also good brand quality, is the, in this case, NTN, Koyo, Nachi, and the Timkins, which is actually made in the USA, but it will fall under the Japanese quality. And then the Chinese, which is a more economical bearing, obviously. And I think those are mainly used in the agricultural market. I mean, just a note to make that in the Chinese manufactured brands, the quality does vary from good to terrible, depending on the materials they use, obviously. Also to keep in mind, all of these bearings are ISO standard of numbering. So the main part number for each bearing size will be exactly the same. The main differences may come in when you look at the prefixes and the suffixes that can vary from brand to brand. Okay, so now we're going to go into the types of bearings and their numbering. The first one we're going to have a look at is the ball bearings, where the balls is rolling elements. The ones we're going to cover today will be the deep groove ball bearing, angular contact ball bearing, the thrust ball bearing, or some call them the axial deep groove ball bearing, and self-aligning ball bearings. Start off with the deep groove ball bearing. So you get a single row deep groove ball bearing. We're only going to cover the metric sizes, just on the numbering and what they mean. So the deep groove, single row deep groove ball bearing will always start with the number 6. In most cases, it will have 4 digits. Of those 4 digits, the second number will determine the outside diameter. And the last 2 numbers determines the bore size of the bearing. And that is in all bearings. So you take the last 2 numbers and you times them by 5. And that'll give you the bore diameter of the bearing. There are 4 exceptions in this instance, and it's 00, which is 10 millimeters, 01, which is 12 millimeters, 02, which is 15 millimeters, 03, which is 17 millimeters. And that'll go for all bearings or most bearings. Like I said in the beginning, there will be some exceptions as well. Just one thing to keep in mind as well, the deep groove ball bearing is the most popular and most common bearing used around the world. Okay, just to have a look at some of the exceptions, you get miniature deep groove ball bearings. They only have 3 digits. It'll also start with a 6. Just an example, it'd be like a 608 or a 629 bearing. Some deep groove ball bearings, they have 5 digits. Example will be a 62307, something like that. And if there is a slash present in the part number, example is 62/28, you don't times the last 2 numbers by 5. The digits after the slash, that will be the bore diameter in millimeters. And just in the bearing that has only 3 digits, the last number will be the bore diameter as well in millimeters. For instance, a 608, the bore diameter will be 8 millimeters. Okay, just an example of a part number, it will be 6305. So it will give you the 6 series, which is a deep groove ball bearing single row. That is the OD size, the outside diameter size, and that will give you, it's the 3rd largest in the range. And the last 2 numbers, you times by 5, and that will be the inside diameter, the bore size of that bearing. Single row deep groove ball bearings are normally sold as sealed, shielded, or open bearings. Just to have a look at some common suffixes of these bearings that you can look out for and the meanings of them. 2RSR or 2RS1 in the SKF one has the same meaning, which is rubber seals on both sides of the bearing. 2Z, which is the same for FIG and the SKF branded ones, is metal shields on both sides. C3, which has to do with the internal clearance of the bearing. C3 means the internal clearance is bigger than C normal. And C4 will be the internal clearance is bigger than C3. And another common one is ZNR, which means it has a metal shield on one side with a snap ring groove on the outside of the bearing. If there are no suffixes present, this will be an open bearing with a C normal or C standard internal clearance. Okay, next up, you're going to have a look at the double row deep groove ball bearings. So the number will start with a 4. It will have 4 digits. Again, the second number will determine the outside diameter. And like I said, with all bearings, the last 2 digits, the last 2 numbers determines the bore size. Just an example there, 4207. Again, that first one will give you the type of bearing that it is. Deep groove, double row deep groove ball bearings are normally sold as open bearings. Just to keep in mind, when you do order bearings, please have a look at the numbers on the bearing itself, not on the seal. It has happened before that someone would want a sealed 4207 bearing and they take the seal out of a 6207 and just put it in the 4207, then you'll end up with the wrong bearing. Common suffixes to look out for there, TVH, or in the SKF instance, the equivalent is TN or TN9, and that has to do with the cage. So the cage will be made out of a polyimide cage, and then C3, which is the internal clearance, again, is bigger than C normal. You'll notice that on a lot of the suffixes, it's exactly the same, and it has the same meaning. Now we're going to have a look at angular contact ball bearings. Single row angular contact ball bearings. The number will always start with the number 7. It will have 4 digits. Second number, again, will determine the outside diameter of the bearing. And the last 2 numbers will determine the bore size. example there, 7314. Single row angular contact ball bearings are normally sold as open bearings. They can also be sold in pairs or as a single unit. The suffix of the bearing is important to determine this. We'll have a look at some common suffixes now. So this is where the suffixes are quite critical and quite important when you do order them. So TVH we have covered, it's a polyimide gauge, but in this instance the SKF turns to the letter P. P5 and P6, which refers to the tolerance class of the bearing. So P5 will be a higher precision tolerance class than a P6. Just to quickly explain what the tolerance class of the bearing is. So if the bearing's inside the diameter or outside the diameter is supposed to be, let's call it 50 millimeters, the tolerance class will say, okay, it can be 50 millimeters, give or take 20 microns, for instance. So if it's made up to a P5 or P6 tolerance class, it will mean it will not be, the tolerance will be less than 20 microns, it might be 10 or 5 microns. So you're sure to having a higher tolerance bearing to fit over your shaft or into the housing. The critical one here will be on the FAG side. It's the suffix UA, UL or UO. On the SKF side, the equivalent will be CA, CB and CC. And that will indicate that it's the bearing is used, designed to work in pairs. And then another one is the JP suffix, or in SKF's instance, the J, which will indicate that the cage is made out of a normal steel cage. Okay, as we go along, the double row angular contact ball bearing, the number will start with a 3 or a 5. In the premium brands, it will normally start with a 3, and the more economical brands, it will start with a 5. It also has 4 digits, and this is quite critical as we go along, and later in the content that we'll cover, you'll see why it's important that it only has 4 digits to memorize that. The second number will again determine the outside diameter of the bearing, and the last 2 numbers will determine the bore size in millimeters. Just an example of that, 3209. It's a 3 series bearing with 4 digits. It tells me it's a double row angular contact. That determines the OD, and that determines the inside diameter. Double row angular contact ball bearings are normally sold as open bearings, sealed bearings, or shielded bearings. To have a quick look at the suffixes. So again, 2RS or 2RS1 indicates the rubber seals, 2Z, the metal shields on both sides, C3, the internal clearance that is bigger than C normal or C standard. The new one that we have a look at here is M, and that indicates that the cage is made out of brass, and the TVH and TN suffix is a polyimide cage. Going on to the thrust ball bearings or axial deep groove ball bearings. I know some people also know them 3-piece bearings. The number will always start with a 5, and it will have 5 digits. That's why it's important, because if it only has 4 digits, it's the double row angular contact. So it will have 5 digits, and the third number determines the OD, and again the last 2 numbers determines the bore size of the bearing. Obviously, you can see from the pictures in the previous clip that thrust ball bearings cannot be sealed or shielded, and they're only sold as open bearings. The only variant in the suffixes that you'll get from them will be M, which will indicate a brass gauge. Okay, having a look at the fourth of the ball bearings that we're covering today is a self-aligning ball bearing. Again, we're only covering the metric sizes. So the number will start with the 1 or a 2. And that first number that it starts with determines the width of the bearing. It'll have 4 digits. Again, the second number will determine the outside diameter of the bearing. And again, the last 2 numbers will determine the bore size of the bearing. Self-aligning ball bearings are normally sold as open bearings, but seal bearings are also relatively common. Self-aligning ball bearings comes with a straight or a taper ball. Just quickly have a look there. You can have a look at those ones. There's a taper bearing, and there's the cylindrical ball. Just to keep in mind, if it does have a taper ball, normally it will work in conjunction with an adapter or a withdrawal sleeve. Having a look at the common suffixes, again 2RS, which is the rubber seals on both sides. C3, the internal clearance bigger than C normal. And then the K, which will indicate that it has a taper ball. That is also very important, so to ensure that you do get the correct one that you're looking for. And then the last one is TVH or TN9, which will indicate again the polyamide gauge. So that in brief is on the ball bearings that we're going to cover today. We're going to move over to the roller bearings now, which will have rollers as rolling elements. The 3 ones we're going to cover there will be the taper roller bearing, spherical roller bearing, and cylindrical roller bearings. Having a look at the taper roller bearings, again we're only covering the metric sizes. It's also known as a cup and cone bearing. The bearing will always start with the number 3, and it will have 5 digits. And that's again where it's important. You remember the double row angular contact will also start with a 3, but it will have 4 digits only. So if it starts with a 3, 5 digits, it will be a tapered roller bearing. The third number will determine the outside diameter. The second number will determine the width of the bearing. And then again, the last 2 numbers will determine the bore size. Example of those will be a 32317. Taper roller bearings are mostly sold as open bearings, and they don't really have any suffixes. Having a look at spherical roller bearings, the bearing number will always start with a 2. It'll have 5 digits. The third number determines the OD. The second number will determine the width. And the last 2 numbers will determine the bore size of the bearing. There you can look at an example. The spherical roller bearings are normally sold as open bearings. Main reason for that will be that it goes into a housing, and that housing will have its own seals to seal the unit. Spherical roller bearings comes in a straight or a taper ball. Having a look at the common suffixes we use with spherical roller bearings will again be C3. The K, again, that indicates the taper ball. K30, which will indicate the ratio of the taper, will be a 1 to a 30. And then the new one here will be, in FAG's instance, T41, or in SKF, the VA405 or VA406, which will indicate that it's for oscillating load or vibrating screens, and automatically comes with a C4 internal clearance. And then the last one is an M or MA, which will indicate a brass gauge. Going on to the cylindrical roller bearings, again metric sizes. The bearing number will normally start with a N, NU, NJ, NUP in most instances. It will have 3 or 4 digits. If there's 3 digits, the first number determines the outside diameter, and if it has 4 digits, the first number determines the width. If there's 4 digits, the second number determines the outside diameter. And once again, the last 2 numbers determines the bore size of the bearing. So then we'll look at the example of a part number there, NU328 or NJ2307. Cylindrical roller bearings are only sold as open bearings. Having a look at the suffixes, C3 again indicates the internal clearance is bigger than C normal. C4, which is also quite common, indicates the internal clearance is bigger than C3. TVP2, or in SKF's instance, the P will indicate a polymite gauge, and M, the brass gauge. Just to keep in mind, when ordering these bearings, that first one is very important. So that we call the prefix of the bearing. So the N means that the outer ring can slide to both sides. So you can just look there and you can see that. NU will indicate that the inner ring can slide to both sides. NJ will indicate that the inner ring can slide to one side only. There you can see that it can slide, and there is a little ridge, so it'll be able to slide to one side only. And then the NUP, that will indicate that the inner ring and outer ring are fixed or located. And then you get the L section ring, which is a HJ, and that will work with the NJ bearing. Okay. Having a look at plain bearings. So plain bearings has no rolling elements, like you can see there. All other ones have balls or rollers as rolling elements. Plain bearings has no rolling elements. The bearing number will normally start with a GE, and then the number that follows will indicate the bore diameter of that bearing. So GE20, the bore diameter will be 20 millimeters. Some common suffixes to have a look out there. 2RS, again, rubber seals on both sides. The UK, or the C, or a TX, will indicate maintenance-free bearings. And then DO or ES, which will indicate a lubrication groove and a lubrication hole on the outside of on the outer ring of the bearing. Okay, so that covers about the bearings that we're going to cover today. Hopefully you can get just a little bit more insight on the basics on how to order bearings to ensure that you do order the correct bearings to minimize downtime, obviously. Next on, we're going to cover just a bit of info on counterfeit bearings. So fake or counterfeit bearings are not easy to identify, as they look very similar to the original items. There's just a nice little picture there that will show you that it's very difficult to distinguish between those, which ones are counterfeit and which ones are real. But some of the major differences between the original and the counterfeit bearings are the quality of the steel being used in the manufacturing process, the sizing of the rolling elements, the lubrication that's being used, and the lubrication points of the bearings, the internal clearances, tolerances, and dimensions of those bearings, and then the hardening process of the steel. So what effect does a counterfeit bearing have? Due to the inferior quality, materials, and operational systems being used for the manufacturing of these bearings, the operating life of the bearing dramatically decreases. So obviously, this will mean that you'll spend a fortune on purchasing the same bearing. This can also cause major unplanned breakdowns. And in production plants, that is a major problem. That'll end up costing you more than 10 times as much as just buying the original product the first time around. Some of the most common bearings that are being counterfeited will include FAG, SKF, Timken, NSK, and NTN. The latest case that we know of counterfeit bearings being seized in South Africa was in August 2020. We have a little bit of an article and the police report and everything on our website. You're welcome to have a look at that. Obviously, there are some ways to try and avoid buying counterfeit bearings, which you'll also find on our website, which you're more than welcome to visit after we're done. Just keep in mind, guys, whenever a price, especially on price, seems too good to be true, normally that is the case. You're more than welcome just to checking with us if it is original, if it is the correct thing. We'll be able to help you out where possible. Okay, just some brief info about Bearings 2000. So Bearings 2000, we are suppliers of bearings, power transmission, and seals. The company was founded 28 years ago. We are a second-generation family business. We have over 50 employees, 7 locations nationwide. We are very large stockists of our products. We have a comprehensive product range and proven industry-leading service. Quick look at our national footprint. So we are in the Western Cape. We're in the Northwest, Mpumalanga, Gauteng, and KwaZulu-Natal. Quick look at the brands that we stock. You can have a look there. I'm not going to go through all of them. But as you can see, we pride ourselves on quality, and that's why we'll stock quality products as well. Some clientele that we do service, they're also on there. You can see there's some big guys there that require quality products at a quality service. And that's why they chose us, because that's what we can provide. Guys, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. Any questions, you can put it in the chat. We can try and answer them as best as we possibly can. And I hope you enjoyed it and you found some info useful that you can take forward and that will help you purchasing the correct bearing and less downtime. You can see that our website is also on there. Please visit our website. That will definitely give you a better idea and some tips on how to avoid those counterfeit bearings.